On the 5th day of Christmas my true love gave to me 5 golden rings, or Bands and Shackles, an original short story by Charlie C.C. Thomas. Once upon a time, in a land far away and forgotten by all who still draw breath, there was a town without neighbor or friend, and whose residents had long forgotten how they came to be there. But they were happy to be there, for they had their own customs and ways, their own times and celebrations, and their own trials and dangers, which kept them locked in the borders of their little town. Mostly. Now, in Cunningham Manor on the northern border of the town, Lady Barbara Cunningham's birthing chambers were being emptied, with all her effects returned to the bedchambers she shared with Lord Cunningham. The maids and servants had been busy about it for the last 2 days, and all was nearly done. The last remaining task was to empty the lady's vanity of its jewellery and niceties, and take them to the other side of the east wing. And to do it, the housekeeper had appointed a young new hire, a short, petite maid with a lovely face that had brightened many a gloomy room with her easy smile. Her name was Martha, and presently she was stood before the lady's vanity, pulling cushioned tablets from its drawers to ensure the rings were all present before she moved on to the necklaces and bands, and then carted them off. She sighed as she set the first tablet atop the wide wooden piece, then the next, until all 7 were free of the top drawer, each a wooden frame with cushioned rows between which the rings were pinched upright. The little bands glittered gold and silver in the noonday light, gems casting coloured rays around each other as Martha's eyes danced over them. She smiled her infectious smile and traced her hand in the air over the frames, forgetting to count so that she had to start over again. She chuckled to herself, going slowly from tablet to tablet, as she admired the elegant swans and sapphire of one band, the ivy and ruby of another, and a broad band with dancing fawns holding up a speckled opal. From one trinket to the next she moved, until she stopped on the last tablet, the oldest, she knew, which had been passed from the late Helena Cunningham to the Lord's new wife, Lady Barbara. It held all manner of beasts and folk, rabbits of 3 with diamond eyes, silver ravens with wings holding a black stone, jasper honeybees dancing around a ruby with the flames of the sun winding down the golden sides. Another was crafted after does, then stags, then doves, and trees and vines. Others were shaped like hands round the stones, or like strong men, wrapped round the finger, and others still like beautiful women in flowing gowns. But it was the serpents that proved to be the late lady's favourite beast, for of the 57 on the final tablet, more than half were fashioned after the likeness of snakes, familiar and foreign alike. Martha's smile drooped, her eyes glittering like the black diamond eyes of the golden adder that ended her count. She leaned closer until she could see the scales carved into its winding body, length coiled at the top with its head grossly large to show the gems in its skull. It hissed, and its fangs framed a milky gem that turned red, purple, green, or orange as the light hit it. She smiled until her teeth showed, fingers gracing its snout. Then something cold ran up her spine, and she stood straight, the smile gone as she looked to the shut door behind her and sighed for the lack of watchful eyes. She cleared her throat and bit her lip, fingers wringing her white uniform skirts as she stared at the lovely serpent. "All this wealth," she thought. "They seem nice enough folk, all that they are, but look at the dust on some of these. They must have gone months, years without wearing them." And it was true. Some of the late lady's rings were so caked with dust that when Martha brushed them, what she thought was silver proved to be gold. "It seems such a waste for them to sit and collect dust. And years of the former lady's disappearance, I doubt the new one's worn some of these even once." Martha's face sunk as her family blossomed in her mind. Her father was dead and her mother old. She was the eldest daughter of 3 sisters and only just old enough to do serious work, but even the generous wage the Cunninghams gave was scarce enough to pay off the debts for her father's burial, not to mention the many repairs needing done, nor the herbs she bought from the old crone who always visited them. She hadn't been on long enough to earn any serious wages, there wasn't enough trust yet for that, and she knew it would come in time, but how much time have I to wait? How much longer must Mother suffer? My sisters go without. She gripped her stomach, the pain of hunger a thankfully distant memory. Most of the food can go to them now, since I'm fed here, but what's a loaf of bread and gruel between two growing girls? She smiled despite herself and chuckled, her hands coming together. They might as well be boys. She found the rings again, lip nearly bleeding as she mulled it raw. Then her mouth fell open and shut again with a sad smile. She shook her head and double-checked her count, fingers and eyes running over the little bands until she came to the end. She lingered on 2 of the smaller bands, the gold in them enough for 2 gold coins, the gems more like to be worth 10. She darted her eyes away with a huff and stacked the tablets to one side of the vanity, opening the next drawer and counting the necklaces, each a lovely cord or chain of gold and silver with gems hanging off them in regular spaces or from the band's center. She swallowed against the glint of those precious things as she stacked the tablets together in the middle of the vanity and opened the 3rd drawer to count the bands. She had to restart thrice as she went, eyes darting back and forth between the glittering jewels before they fell on the stacked rings. She set her mouth and turned back to finish her count of the bands, fat, thin, long, chained and braided wire. They're good folk, she whispered to herself as she finished her count and stacked the tablets of bracelets and anklets. They don't deserve that. And your family? A voice said in the back of her mind. Do they deserve to go hungry? Do little Ruth and Sarah deserve to go work so young? Does your mother deserve to sit at home and fall into despair at how useless she's become? Martha stopped, hands gripping the bottom of the tablets of bands to hoist them up. She stared forward to the wall, painted with lifelike birds and stags and huntsmen afar off. They needn't ever know, the voice came again. If I take the ones she's least like to wear, she'll never see. Martha licked her lips and let her hands slip aside, eyes sliding until they found the tablets of rings. Just 2. She can't possibly miss 2 small bands that she's never worn. And Lord Cunningham hasn't even admired them since his first wife's death, came the voice. So he'll be no wiser to it than the lady. She moved without realizing, hands finding the rings and setting the tablets on the floor to look through the former lady's bands. There were 3. Surely she wouldn't miss 3, would she? That were simple, thin bands with tiny stones that were each covered in thick dust. She licked her lips and checked over her shoulder again. The door was shut, and she was alone. Then she took up the 3 rings. She stuffed them between her slip and corset and lifted the other tablets back in place before she smoothed out her uniform and looked round the room. Then she closed the distance to the door, picked up the tablets of bands, and carried them to Lady Barbara's chambers, where her handmaid would set everything in order. Then again with the necklaces and the rings. Finally, she stood before the vanity and checked the drawers, despite her count being what it was told her. Yet, when she traced the inside of the drawer, she touched something large and cold. She pulled it into the light, looking over her shoulder and back again to brush the dust and grime away, and marvel at the ruby-studded golden ring, shaped after the face of the sun. She smiled and breathed a laugh to herself before she stood straight and tucked the unexpected gem away, closing the drawer and checking the rest for more surprises. There was nothing else to be had, so she left and went to Mistress Esther's chambers to clean it of dust. She'd been gone for a week, courting with the lordling Jasper Fisher, and would return tomorrow night. She set things in order as the mistress's handmaid, Madeline, had said, even pulling out her vanity chair. As she made the bed and tucked the new sheets, she hit something hard. She winced on instinct, though it didn't bite, and stood straight enough to hurt her back before she furrowed her brows and pulled up the thick mattress. It was a shining silver ring with 2 doves flying around a large diamond. Her eyes went wide and she froze, heart thudding in her ears as she looked to the door, and the voice returned. She lost it in her sleep, or else tucked it away and has forgotten it. It's such a shame to leave a beauty as this unworn and unappreciated. Martha bit her lip. The mattress lowered as she reached and plucked the ring up, holding it before her face.
But what if it was purposeful, and she means to retrieve it? What if this is a treasure of hers? What if I'm found out?
If it's so important, then they'll ask about it. Save that one for the last to sell, and if it comes up, then bring it back to a room and scatter it somewhere beneath the bed or a table and claim that it must have come loose from under the bed when you were changing the sheets, and didn't notice it fly. Martha swallowed, and flicked back to the open door instead, stashing the band with the rest before finishing her work, and moving on to Master Ezra's chambers. At evenfall, with her work done, Martha began the trek back to town, her feet already aching when she crossed over Python Bridge and screaming on the road beside Fisher Fields, so that she had to slip out of her simple flat shoes. With a sigh, she continued down the road for another half-hour, until she reached the town gates and stepped again into her shoes to cross the cobblestone roads and weave her way through the artisans, taking up a quarter of the town. Finally, she passed through the lovely old homes in the centre and crossed by the graveyard to the north, before she descended the hill overlooking the hundreds of houses in Boots Heel. The poor and destitute called the alleys home in the night, and thankfully they'd already taken to their taverns and beds despite the sun still giving a little light ahead of her. But by the time she reached her house and opened the gates, it was dark, and the common room on the first floor of the brick and wood structure was alight with candles. She smiled up at the 3-story home, sighing through her nostrils as one of the shutters opened and a small old woman leaned out, her mess of grey curls pulled back under her colourful scarf as she set her pipe to her lips and lit her snuff. She smiled down on Martha with a wave and nod as she took the little path to the old front door. Martha waved with a tired grin and stepped inside, barring the door behind her as she stepped out of her shoes and creaked down the old hall to the common room. It was the largest in the house besides the kitchens to accommodate the few tenants they'd lured in, but it looked enormous with just her sister sat cross-legged by the low fire. Martha stopped in the doorway, leaning on the post with a smile as her shoes dangled from one hand and the other rose to the cache of rings in her bosom. Ruth, the middle sister, was the first to turn. The firelight turned her brown eyes hazel, and her smile lit the rest as she exclaimed that Martha was home and stood, pulling Sarah up with her. Both girls lashed their arms around her waist and legs, their dark braids swinging as they pulled away and asked after her day. She smiled and petted their heads as she walked to sit in one of the old sofas, facing each other in the middle of the room, leaning on the arm closest to the fire and letting her shoes fall to the floor. Her sisters crowded around her, forgetting that they'd asked about her day and rolling into their own stories of running through the market, what they bought, and the funny things the old woman told them when they got back. They told her about Old Man Wicker's bad attitude, which was nothing new, but apparently he was particularly sour at midday over the state of the Upper West District.
He went on and on about the smell of the streets,
Ruth said,
as if they were any different than yesterday. And all aside, it'll be winter shortly, so all the stink will freeze away. Oh, then we can sit around the fire and have cider and hot wine and cakes,
Sarah added with a leap. Martha smiled, hand going to the rings again as the other found Sarah's shoulder and calmed her.
To be sure, but we must be a little quieter, lest we wake the house. Now, tell me of Mother. Does she sleep? How's she eat today? Your mother ate well, child,
the old woman said in her strange accent as she entered the common room.
I made sure of that myself. And your sisters were a great help.
She smiled around her pipe and nodded at them with glittering eyes. She made her way across the room with no more difficulty than a woman half her age and a face to match, her back straighter than Martha's sometimes. And she was truly a little woman, barely a head taller than Ruth. Beside a man, the old woman might look a child playing at being an old woman in bright green and yellow robes. She sat across from Martha, hopping onto the cushion and pulling her legs under her as she leant on the arm and sighed at the warmth of the low fire.
And she still sleeps. I saw to it with a brew of tea. She shan't wake until sunrise, methinks, but she does so need her rest.
The woman smiled and took her pipe from her mouth, the smoke filling the room with sweet warm things that made Martha sigh and want to be as excited for autumn as Sarah.
Thank you,
she simply said.
You've been a blessing from heaven since you found us.
The old woman waved her hand dismissively with a grin.
I'm happy to help how I can. It's my way. We shall tend to those in need and ask only to be tended in return. And aside, what's an old woman to do with herself otherwise?
She chuckled and breathed deeply from her pipe, the tattoos dark in the firelight on her olive arms.
Regardless, you have my thanks, and shall receive due kindness.
The old woman's amber eyes sparkled like harvest moons as she held Martha's gaze with a gentle lift to her lips, smoke falling.
You've given me much kindness, child, and have my love for it. There are not many a kind soul in the world, no matter where one might look. So it is good to let bloom the flower of goodness when one finds it.
Martha smiled, then her hand found the rings still hidden on her bodice, and the lift of her lips drooped. She swallowed as something cold dug into her belly like prodding knuckles.
What is it?
The little old woman asked, and then her sisters, when they saw her face. Martha licked her lips, eyes alight again, and smiled back on her face as she gripped the arm of the sofa and pulled herself up.
It's nothing. I tire, though, so I think I might retire.
The old woman stirred for a moment, flitting to Martha's hand, then face, before she gave a tight smile and nodded with the pipe raised.
A good idea. Come, young ones, let us all retire then. I have need of you both in the garden tomorrow.
Sarah and Ruth both plucked up and asked what they would do, so the old woman stood and laced her arms with theirs as she led them out of the room, Martha close behind, and told them of wild marigolds needing transplanting. But Martha didn't listen to the rest. She just kissed her sisters' heads and turned the opposite way to her chambers past her mother's, whom she could hear snoring through the door. She smiled at that and pushed inside her own chambers, shutting the door with a sigh as she looked on her little room and smiled, crossing the distance to open the window and let in the moonlight, and what little candlelight came from those who refused sleep's call. She took off her outer clothes and stood alone in her underthings, lips tight as the knuckles dug deeper in her belly, deeper still as she rummaged for the 5 rings in her corset. They pooled in her palm, clinking like sweet chimes and twinkling in the full moon's light, the gold and silver, the diamonds, rubies, the onyx. She swallowed and smiled despite herself, rolling them in her palm to sing their high tunes, eyes fixed on their glitter and dance. And each ring of their song lessened the cold knuckles in her gut, made her face a little warmer, her smile a little higher, until she forgot why she was so worried.
I'll wait to sell them,
she thought.
And not all at once, lest someone think me a thief and report it or assume I've found some greater wealth and stalk me.
Yes, the voice said in the back of her mind. Yes, dear. Wait, so you're not found out. And in the meantime, what harm could there be in wearing them? She smiled and tilted her head, picking up the ring fashioned after the sun, surrounded by rubies.
It would be such a waste to not enjoy them whilst they're in my possession.
Then she went to her bed and set the rest on the little table beside to slip the ring on her fingers until she found it fit nicely on her thumb. She returned to the window and held her hand under the moon, marvelling at the gold, a trinket forgotten by the Cunninghams, yet something more precious than half a year's wages.
Only at night,
she whispered to herself,
and when I'm alone. If they have to be my secret, why shouldn't I enjoy them?
Her infectious smile crept up her cheeks, lighting her face. But there was something else there, too, something that made the light of her eyes a little dimmer, and dimmer still, as she slipped on each of the rings until every finger was ornamented. She sat on her bed and stared, making her fingers dance and giggling at how beautiful they were on her hand. How much more beautiful her hand looked, dressed in gold and gems. She looked at them as she took off the rest of her garments and stepped into her nightgown, as she lay beneath her blankets, as her eyes lilted and she fell into her dreams. In them, bands covered her arms to the shoulder and leg to the hip. Chains and plates hung from her neck to cover her breasts and back. Golden bells hung from her waist. Rings covered her fingers and toes. And on all of it, gems sparkled in the noonday sun as she walked naked through the streets of town. Clear, pink and black diamonds glistened, yellow, pink and red jasper, sapphires, turquoise and opal, jade, tourmaline and amethyst, ruby, quartz and tiger's eye. And she walked and smiled and danced under the sun. She ran and laughed, but then a golden chain clattered to the ground from out of the sky, and when she looked down, it was connected to a great golden shackle on her wrist. The golden bands and chains tightened until she was held straight as a statue, and the chain went taut. It toppled her face first into the cobblestones and drug her down the streets with a sparking clamour. Drug her down the old roads beside Fisher Fields and over Python Bridge to the front steps of Cunningham Manor. The twin statues either side the entrance trembled, and their carved fur came to life as stone eyes sheened and deepened to living flesh. They yawned and stretched as the doors opened, turning to find the man who'd opened them and bowing their heads. A naked man, covered in hard muscle and coarse hair, with long, thick locks down his grizzled back, and a golden crown of massive antlers sprouting from his hairline. He came down the steps on massive cloven hooves, legs something like a stag and bull both, and stooped, flipping Martha over with one motion to smile his long, pointed fangs at her. "Hello, daughter. Welcome to the woods." Her eyes flew open with a start, and she sat up, casting off the blankets as she looked around and found herself still in her bedchambers. She laughed at herself and shut her eyes, sitting up to wipe her face and hissing away from the cold in her right hand. She blinked, but the blur didn't leave her eyes as she found her hand and the rings still there. She laughed and stood, moving to the window and pushing open the shutters to wipe the grime from her eyes. Yet when she found her fingers to slip off the rings, she stared and gave a nervous chuckle as the light off the rings turned her skin golden. Then her laughter became panting fret as she removed the rings and still found the golden skin. She turned it over in the morning light, eyes wide and brows furrowed as her skin and nails glistened like polished gold. Then she touched her skin, and while her fleshy hand told her the other was cold and solid, the golden skin still moved like skin. Her veins still shone beneath, and her little hairs still blew in the breeze, with all the elasticity of normal hair. She rotated her wrist and squeezed her hand shut. Then she gripped the sill and lightly ran her fingers over the coarse old wood. There was feeling and movement of flesh, just as there should have been, but her hand was gold. She swallowed and turned to the rings, quickly grabbing them and throwing them into an unassuming box that she stashed beneath her bed. Then she swallowed, looked around, and backed into the wall.
"Surely they'll know now."
"Why?" came the voice. "Why shouldn't you have merely befallen a curse elsewhere?" She nodded, licking her lips as she pushed herself off the wall toward her uniform, pulling it up into the air and shaking it out with a wry grin.
Yes, how would they know? But the attention still would warrant more questions than for which I could imagine answers."
Then her eyebrows went up with memory, and she fetched the gloves which weren't required, but were still given as part of her uniform. She changed out of her nightgown into her uniform quickly, kneeling before her bed to push the box forward until it sat against the wall beneath her headboard. Then she stood and looked at her golden hand once more, thankful for once for the long sleeves of her uniform before she donned her gloves and rushed downstairs. She hurriedly said her goodbyes to Sarah and Ruth, who ate a breakfast, no doubt, from the old woman, passing Old Man Wicker as she crossed the yard with a quick good morning and a grumble from him. Then she was off, past the gate, through the town and down the road to stand before the massive twin black cats either side the front doors, their yellow and green eyes the only difference between them. She stopped and swallowed, half waiting for them to come to life and the doors to open with the strange creature from her dreams to come down and welcome her to the forest. but none of that happened. So she rushed around the manor for the doors to the kitchen yard, and rushed between everyone and down the halls until she found the housekeeper and was given her position for the day. She was to put to cleaning again, though most of the girls were, to make the manor ready for Mistress Esther's return. She set herself to work on the chimneys first, taking her no more than an hour with all the extra hands, and she went alone to return the apron and leather gloves and washed her arms, for the soot and ash had a way of finding its way between glove and sleeve. But when she loosed her hands and undid her sleeves, she stopped in wonder at the gold which had faded to the middle of her forearm. She swallowed and washed quickly, telling herself that if she should just finish that day, she could show the little old woman that she might apply her herbs and roots to it. So she worked on into the morning, dusting, sweeping, and polishing the wood of the manor like all the rest. And as she worked, a young man with a long face and strong nose passed her by. Felix, his name was, a servant whom she'd taken a liking to, and could understand why Master Ezra had for many years now. He was freshly empty-handed, and blotting his hairline with a handkerchief, checking it for something before he put it away in his waist pocket, and smiled with a nod.
"Hope you're not being worked too hard in all this rush,"
she said low, meandering her way closer to him as she polished this piece of wood and that. He stopped and turned, letting her work her way over, wiping down the banister of the second floor.
"How are the rest of you faring, with all the moving and else?"
He sighed with a tired smile. "No more than usual. The kitchens are stocked, and the dining hall is ready to be assembled."
"Dining hall? She's only been gone a week."
He leaned on the railing at a steep angle, his handsome face putting on a kind of smirk, the way that boys did when they weren't skilled in wooing women. They keep a deep love for their family, for everyone under their care, in truth. Even us servants are taken well care of, our families too. He looked down at her hands, and his brows furrowed with a low chuckle. "When did you start wearing your gloves?" he asked, his own gloved fingers tracing the wood to her left hand. She smiled coyly, forcing it to stay as she eyed his hand toying deftly at the wood in front of hers. "Do you find the oils too harsh for your skin?" She chuckled dryly.
"I've worked too long for my hands to be that sort, Felix. I don't know."
He trailed his index finger the length of her left pinky to her wrist and tickled his fingertip between glove and cuff, drawing an actual smile from her before she pulled her hand away.
"Felix, stop, you'll get us both in trouble."
She pushed him lightly with her right hand, and he caught it, lifting it, rag and all, to his lips, where he kissed her knuckles. Her face went hot, and her voice came as a whisper.
"Felix, stop, the others will see."
He smiled up at her from where he stooped, putting her eyes just above his, as a few maids passed them with raised eyebrows and girlish smiles. Some of the men passed too, either wholly indifferent or glancing before they rolled their eyes, though a few did look red in the face as they watched Felix kiss each of her fingers and land a final one on her wrist. She flushed and looked this way and that before the light caught her skin between the glove and sleeve cuff, glittering gold like sunrise. He stopped, eyes darting to her skin and staying there, even as he rose to his full height. Though he was no giant of a man, Martha felt like a moth in the shadow of one who might smite her. She jerked her hand back, but he held on, squeezing it short of pain and flinging wild, wide eyes into her face as he leaned close and hissed, "What did you do?" She locked eyes with him and grimaced, hissing for him to let her go, but he kept on. "What did you steal? When?"
"I'm not a thief,"
she lied. He held up her hand and whispered, half mad, "The only reason you're turning gold is because you stole from the Cunninghams. How long ago? Tell me." He jerked her arm up, mouth agape but eyes shining with their own fire, sweat beading on his forehead.
"I'm not a thief. I was cursed a while ago and it comes and goes. I've someone at home that can make an ointment and soothe it. Let me go."
She pulled her hand free, but he stepped closer so that their bodies almost kissed, breath mingling as he lowered his head, one hand on the banister to bar her way as he pressed closer. "Martha, the wealth of the Cunninghams is cursed. If you covet it enough to steal, then you'll become what you covet." He licked his lips and looked up, checking over his shoulder and taking her upper arm. "Come on." "No," she said a little louder, pushing against him so that he had to turn and face her, her hand grabbing his sleeve and shoving, but only moving the fabric. Then she froze and stared as he kept talking. "If you return it before you're consumed, then the curse can be lifted, but only by Lord Cyrus, so take a horse and bring back whatever you stole. Now, Martha!" But she couldn't look away from his arm. His golden arm. His skin, the hair, was golden as her hand, and as cold, yet malleable as living flesh. She swallowed and found his face, the sweat dripping down his temples, taking a milky film with them and leaving golden rivulets in their wake. Her eyes went wide and she jerked her hand away. Spinning, she flung herself down the hall and wove through the manor. Felix gave chase and called after her, but she was small and quick, even with the extra weight of a golden arm, and soon he was stopped by men asking after him. Thankfully, he said nothing of her, but she knew he wouldn't let her alone. For the rest of the day, as she worked, she kept her eyes up and head on a swivel, leaping from place to place, task to task, on watch for Felix, or any others who might suspect her. "Just a little longer," the voice said in the back of her head, "and you can return home and tell the old woman what's happened. After all, you shan't be here tonight for the mistress's return."
"She's sure to have something for me. Some herb, a tincture, a salve to settle this rash."
But as she worked and the hours passed her by, she rushed into empty rooms and shadows to peel back her sleeve and watch as the gold spread up her elbow, past her shoulder, down her breast, and up her throat. The day was half done, so she buttoned up her collar high as she could and continued. There would only be a few more hard hours, then she could away or even feign illness if need be. "Especially with the return of the mistress, Esther," the voice said. "Given their love for family, they shouldn't want to see her fall ill." But then, with only 2 hours before her leave, the housekeeper lined up the girls in the statue hall of the East Wing. Lively stone figures dressed in armor and clothes alike stood in sills above the walls, and gave her compliments of their work. She was a kindly spider of a woman, rail-thin and looking older than the woman staying in there upstairs, with pale hair a mix of blonde and white, and brown eyes going stormy at the edges. She walked the line, complimenting their work and praising their speed, finishing it all with a few hours to spare, but explaining that there would be no time for rest until bed.
"Though the manor is spotless and well, we are now to help the men finish their work in the dining hall, and whatever else needs finishing before Mistress Esther is due to return."
She stopped at the end of the line and turned, almost shoulder to shoulder with Martha, the statues looming over them with a mix of faces, even looking like they might come alive and become party guests.
"Let's hurry now, no time to waste,"
she said in an authoritative but soft voice, clapping her hands on the last few words to make her point. Then the girls all turned to rush out the west wing. But the housekeeper stopped Martha with a hand to her shoulder. She jumped, stomach twisting into frozen knots as she faced the housekeeper, and resisted the urge to swallow and widen her eyes. Instead, she simply straightened her gown and flicked back up to the other woman's smiling face. Martha's heart sank back into her chest as she spoke.
"Martha, I just wanted to say that though you're the newest hire and have the least experience in service, let alone service to the Cunninghams, you've done remarkably."
Martha smiled, face warm from a blush she hoped the other woman thought was embarrassment instead of guilt.
"Thank you, Mrs. Gondeley. It's been hard at times, but it's a very rewarding position." "I'm sure,"
Mrs. Gondeley said.
"For you and your family, yes?"
Martha nodded, mouth tight.
"Don't worry, child. I know what it is to come from the Upper West. Boots heel, we used to call it, and for good reason."
Martha chuckled.
"We still call it that, ma'am. But it has gotten better, so my mum says."
Mrs. Gondeley smiled and gestured them forward before her eyes fell on Martha's throat and her smile dropped. Her slender hands took Martha's shoulders in an iron grip and spun her until they faced one another. Then the bony fingers lurched to her throat and ripped the collar free, buttons flying to reveal the glittering gold that had spread to her jaw. The smile and poise of the housekeeper was replaced by a tilt of brow and twist of lip that made Martha feel like a dog that had just messed on the rug and would be thrown onto the street. The fire in that old woman's eyes, the scythe-like cut of her frown was bad enough, but the silence of her stare filled the air so that, though they were arm's length apart, Mrs. Gauntlet might as well have been nose to nose with Martha. She didn't speak, didn't growl, hiss, or gnash. She jerked Martha sideways by the shoulder, squeezing her harder than an old woman should have been able, and angling Martha's arm, so that she was constantly tilting to keep from the pain and couldn't stand upright to bolt. She dragged her wordlessly through the manor and up the stairs until they came to a hall filled with the portraits of Cunninghams past and present. "You will wait here," Mrs. Gauntlet said, key appearing in a skeletal grip and unlocking the Lord's study quicker than Martha could blink. Then the door was open, and the old woman drew her against her skinny bodice and shoved her inside with both hands. "The master shall see to you, thief!" Martha pushed herself onto her elbows, legs sprawling as she struggled to find the woman's face in the light from the hall, like the moon before the sun.
"Mrs. Gauntlet."
"Shut your mouth, girl! Lord Cyrus will be here shortly and shall deal with you as he has all the rest. I would pity you your fate had you not brought it upon yourself," she sneered.
"Though mayhap there's still time yet for you to amend your sin and return what was stolen. Though mayhap not."
Then the door shut, the lock locked, and Martha was left in the darkness of Lord Cyrus's study, the shades drawn over the great window opposite the doors overlooking the gardens. She stood and felt through the dark, tripping and cursing more than once, for what felt like eternity before she found the window and pulled the curtains back. She squinted against the light and looked through the glass, through the gardens below, her face twisting before she bared her teeth and screamed. Her fist came against the glass with a metallic clink, but the pane didn't shatter or crack. She tried again with both hands and stopped, panting from the effort of lifting her own arms. She grimaced, face falling from a scowl to a whimpering sob as angry tears trekked her face, and she pulled off her gloves, letting both hands glimmer golden in the evening sunlight. She unbuttoned her cuffs and rolled up her sleeves, both arms golden. She looked at her feet and swallowed, slipping out of her shoes and pulling down her stockings to show flesh and blood ankles and calves, but above glinted the same as her arms. She flung down her skirts with a shrill curse, stepping back and catching the edge of the Lord's desk, teetering sideways until she caught the leather armchair and fell into it hip first. She sat and panted, eyes racing like her mind with 100 ideas and explanations and plans, but none of them were right, and time passed her, marked only by the dip of the sun when the lock jolted and made her jump in the stagnant silence. Then the door opened, with a man walking through it. She half imagined him naked with antlers and hooves, but the candle flame he carried showed he was just a man, if a giant one. Lord Cyrus Cunningham lit the lantern fixed to the study wall until there was enough light for her to make out his features, but not so much that she could have read one of the hundreds of books lining the walls. She licked her lips, eyes flitting from the open door to him as he lit the final lantern, his back to her. She made to stand and froze when he spoke. "If you run, your fate will be worse, and I don't wish this on anyone, even as you are, Martha." She swallowed.
"It's not much of a curse, to be sure. I'll just never have to wear jewellery again."
She stood as her bravado drained out of her, and he turned and blew out his candle, strutting to his desk like a lion and stopping shy of touching it. He towered over her, the top of her head only reaching his waist, and his pale, piercing eyes cut through her. "The curse is not one I enjoy, nor think is even necessary, but I wasn't the one who wove the spell, and I don't know how to unstitch it therefrom." He spoke solemnly, his face suddenly so tired, like he were an old man trying to teach his children the same lesson for the 100th time. "But as I cannot undo what has been done, I need to know if you're consumed by the curse, or if there's still some time to return you to your natural state." Judging by the look of you, I'd say there isn't enough time even if you aren't totally consumed. He sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. You've stolen wealth from my family. Whatever it was, and however small, matters not. As such, the contract you signed dictates that you are subject to the laws of our house and shall be punished accordingly. As it stands, the punishment is to become property of the Cunninghams as both servant and wealth. On this day, you've expanded the wealth of my family by increasing the gold in my house, your very body. And so you shall live here forever after, and serve my family until the Woods King might call your name as tribute to his kingdom. Then you shall serve him. Martha's mouth went open as she stepped back, snorting a laugh that fell as quickly as it came when he found her face, like he'd loosed an arrow and purposefully missed her head.
But I'm not a servant. I'm in your employ.
She launched forward, leaning over the desk with anger evaporating to cold desperation. His face was stone still, but the crook of his lips, the tilt of his eyebrows and lines around his mouth told her that, for all his power, he was as helpless as she. Your wages will continue, and be sent to your family so they might not fall into more dire straits than has been dealt them already.
But what does that make me? I'm a clod of gold? I'm just a talking coin?
You are Martha, but the curse you're subject to has changed your flesh to gold, and forbids you from leaving the grounds lest you become as lifeless as the other statues of the house.
She
stood straight, tears falling down her golden cheeks as metal hands drug over the desktop and fell with a clink against her thighs.
My family, never again.
If you wish it, they are welcome to visit you should they desire. None are barred from these grounds save those who would endanger it. He came around to sit on the edge of his desk. The waning sunlight turned his crystal eyes nearly white. But there is another matter. The curse is not contained to only the thief. Her eyes rushed up to his. It lays on the thing stolen, and will befall any who wear or use it. I must know what you stole and where it is to keep others from this fate.
My house. Beneath my bed in a wooden box, 5 rings.
She rushed up to him and grabbed him by the lapel of his housecoat.
Send someone there. My sisters, please.
He calmly took her hands off his clothes and set it on the desk with deep eyes studying her face before he sighed with a nod and strode across the room and through the open door, motioning her with him. She sprinted to keep up with his stride, her feet beginning to clink on the floor as he motioned to the men at the end of the hall. Tell them where your home is and where the box is. They'll fetch them.
What will you do? You promised that my family will go unarmed?
She grabbed the cuff of his ornate red and yellow robe.
You swear it upon the old folk?
He set his mouth uncomfortably. I swear to keep my word. Then he gently slid her hand from his robes. But now I must attend to my daughter and wife. They've both returned together, and one with the lordling Michael Allen. He requires my assistance with the mending of his wounds. She swallowed and nodded, watching him walk past the 2 men even as she raced to keep pace with him and stopped at the guards. She'd never seen their uniforms before, but that's what they were, she knew. They were guards. Their forest green suits, clamped to their bodies with boiled leather in place of steel, their scalps shaven and their bodies beaten into chiseled strength. They looked at her expectantly but said nothing, so she simply obeyed and told them where her home was, her room, her box of stolen things, and they nodded and turned around. She went to follow them, but as she turned the corner there stood Felix, his face a muddle of anger and sadness with his arms crossed and wrinkling his black suit uniform. The makeup on his face reapplied. I told you. His face was sharp, but not unkind, as if regretting having to say it.
I know.
He glared at her and stepped forward, arms coming up around her and pulling her into his chest. Welcome to the manor, he said with a bitter chuckle, as she shivered, his words reflecting those of the man in her dream. You won't be alone here. We'll make sure of that. He stepped back, and let her go. And one of the lady's maids will show you how to make yourself appear normal, if for your own sake alone." After a tense moment of silence, his eyes fixed on her face as she studied the wall beside him, he continued, "Maybe Madeline, Esther's handmaid, will teach you. She is a gentle girl."
Will I? Am I?
He grabbed her chin as her voice cracked on the verge of tears, pulling her gaze into his. "You're still a woman, now as much as then, as I am a man. And these are good people. They shall treat you better than you think you deserve for why you're here. That's certainly been true for my case. But I cannot say the same for all the staff." He grinned and brushed his thumb over his chin. "Though there are plenty who are like you too, kind and willing to talk to us despite our being servants."
"Indeed,"
came the housekeeper's voice. Felix spun round, hands clutched at his back when he found her, and took a rigid stance, with a slight bow to his head. "Mum," he said respectfully, not meeting Mrs. Gondeley's eyes. She turned her sharp gaze on Martha, sharp as the rest of her bony body, and sneered as if expecting her to act the same as Felix had. Then she continued,
"You are to come with me and be shown the servants' quarters and your cot there."
She spun without a second glance at either of them and barked that Martha follow her. Martha looked to Felix, who silently gestured her to follow, mouthing that they could talk later and to just obey her. Martha swallowed, nodded, and took pace behind Mrs. Gondeley, a fast thing for an old woman. They wound through the house silently, the bustle and hum of the staff and servants now a trickle as they set about their stations or left before Mistress Esther returned with her stepmother, the Lady Barbara. The route was a swift one, taking them clear across the south face of the manor and even across the third stairway that flowed down into the grand foyer, with a procession of servants lining the way, as Mistress Esther and Lady Barbara, babe in hand, walked beside Lord Cyrus, the Cunninghams by blood towering over all of them. The lady, though smiling, seemed dark in the face as she walked arm in arm with her lord husband, her auburn hair falling around without her notice, as they discussed something that had the lord's face set serious and stony. They were too high for her to make out any words, and going too fast to catch much, even if she were beside them. But there was something said about the lady's cousin and his ailment, then something about Martha. But before she could hear another word, they'd crossed the banister for another grand entrance leading through the maze of the Cunninghams' ancestral home. And several tensely silent minutes later, they were in the northwestern corner and climbing the winding stairs for the second highest floor that opened on a warehouse of columns and cots stacked 3 high and riveted into sturdy metal posts at each corner with a table beside and a lamp atop.
"Follow,"
Mrs. Gondeley said without looking, walking into the gloom, for the near-endless room grew darker the deeper one went. But when the darkness was much too thick to walk safely, the housekeeper picked up a lamp from the table and lit a match she seemed to produce from thin air, setting the wick ablaze. Then she carried on, past rows and rows of stacked cots, until she stopped and faced Martha, leaving the lit lamp on the table and picking up the cold one that had been there to light herself a fresh flame.
"Here, sit. Madeline will be with you once the processions are done. She'll teach you to paint your skin and how to dab your sweat so it doesn't run, and she'll bring your new uniform, likely. You'll need the padding so we don't hear you clinking around the house all day, curse me."
Then she walked back into the darkness the way they'd come, not rushing, but with such a long stride she might as well have been. As Martha followed her with her eyes, the bony old woman stopped before she happened on the stairs, as a man, a guard, stood before her. They talked for a moment, and Mrs. Gondeley found Martha again and pointed her way. Then the guard said something, and the old woman shouted through the darkness after her, ordering her to collect her lamp and follow the guard.
"There's urgent business what needs attending in the Lord's study."
Then the housekeeper was gone down the stairs, and the guard was left with his own lamp, staring after her and calling for her again, emphasizing the importance that she hurry. Martha was up with her lamp and beside the guard in 10 seconds, then half sprinting back across the manor and climbing stairs, the guard's pace double that of the old woman and making Martha sprint to keep up. But finally, Martha panting and their lamps out and left behind, they crossed through the paintings of Cunninghams for the guard to open the door and guide her inside with his hand on her upper back. He shut the door, staying outside with no footsteps, saying that he was gone. Cyrus Cunningham sat in his office chair, smiling sadly at a little girl perched on his thigh as if she were his own daughter. But she wasn't.
Ruth?
Martha gaped and rushed for the desk, golden hands clanking on the polished wood as Cyrus motioned for her to stop. "The reason I hate this is more than I've said, Martha." His voice was gentle as his massive hands clutched Ruth, her long, half-hollow cheeks glinting gold in the lamplight as the other end of the desk. Martha's breath froze in her chest and sent her blood pooling in her feet so that she had to lean hard on the desk to keep from fainting. He continued, "The curse will come upon any who don or use what's stolen, even if they weren't the thief. Your sister was found like this in your home, being tended to by a crone as my guards tell it. But there is good news. The box and the rings were all found and here, but I'm afraid your sister must return them to you, and then you to me, before the blight will lift from her flesh." Ruth's eyes were wide and wet, but not afraid. They were flashing this way and that with confusion, like she were a cat pulled from the window by a stranger and brought to another house. In fact, Martha reasoned that was next to the truth of it.
"It's all right, Ruth,"
Martha said, eyes fluttering as she regained her composure and found the Lord's long face.
"She just has to pass it back to me."
"No more or less. She to you, then you to me, and the curse will be ended." He slid the box of her stolen things across the desk in front of Ruth and looked down to her as if he were going to say something, then stopped and found Martha's face. She spoke up.
"Ruth, sweetie pie, I'll explain everything in a moment, but right now I need you to hand me back those rings, all right? The ones you found in my box?"
Ruth protested, but Martha shut her up, rounding the desk with wide, wild eyes and a quick breath as she cupped her face, golden hands on her golden face. But the eyes, they were the same.
"No games. I don't care if you rifled through my things. Take the box. They're in there, yes? Right, take the box and return it to me. Right now, and I'll explain everything." "Martha, what's going on? Why do you look like this? What's happening to us? Is it this place? Are they cursed like everyone says?"
Martha took her sister's hands harshly until her little mouth peeled back in a hiss, a golden hiss.
"Ruth, give back the box to me, then I'll explain, yeah?"
Ruth, sniffling and shaking, reached across the desk and took up the box, holding it out to Martha. She took it in a heartbeat and shoved it into the Lord's chest over Ruth's head.
"Here, take it. It's yours, and I stole it, and I'm in the wrong. I return to you what's yours."
Lord Cyrus took the box with a nod and set it back on the desk with a relieved sigh, picking Ruth up and setting her before Martha, who fell to her knees and wrapped her arms around her as he spoke. "It's done. Watch and see for yourself." He dabbed at his forehead and sighed as if he'd slid a massive weight off his shoulders and walked around his desk languidly. Martha pulled away from Ruth and held her at arm's length, the glitter in her eyes returning as the gold receded in a strange muddled line across her face and down her right shoulder until all of her was whole in less than 10 seconds. Martha smiled and brought Ruth back into her arms, squeezing her hard and wincing when she pushed at Martha's chest and scowled down at her where she knelt.
"What is happening?"
she half shouted, her glare rolling from Martha to Lord Cunningham and back, face going red.
"Better than gold,"
Martha thought. But before she could speak, the Lord filled the shadows with a low rumble of a voice she'd never heard him use before, almost like the one from the man in her dreams. The air chilled, and Martha broke a sweat down her back. "I'll leave you to speak with your sister. Tonight you have no duty in lieu of love, but tomorrow you are no longer your own daughter." He swallowed and rubbed his eyes, suddenly heavy and sheening as if he'd broken into fever. "Now excuse me, but I must attend to young Michael Allen, my ally. will be waiting below. You may leave as you wish, but the guard outside will accompany you, that you don't wander where you shouldn't." He said the last as he turned for the door and pulled it open, his giant silhouette nearly normal in the giant doorway until he walked past the guard, shoulder at his head. Ruth found her sister's face again, still twisted and angry, insisting Martha tell her what in the world was happening. And Martha did. She told her everything that she could remember while she fiddled with Ruth's braid and the wry hairs refusing to stay down. And in the end, Martha pulled Ruth into her arms and made a promise to take care of their mother.
"And see me as often as you can. Don't leave me in this place, Ruth. Promise me."
5 golden rings, 4 calling birds, 3 French hens.